Also, my presentation will not be technical, but will give a perspective on why cities actually want to invest in electromobility and what their thoughts are about inductive charging at the end as well. So when it comes to POLIS electromobility activities, we closely follow, of course, what is happening on the European level with regards to policy initiatives from the European institutions and how this may impact on the local level. But also we closely liaise with our member cities and regions when it comes to collecting expertise, feeding into their activities, but also bringing their expertise back to the European level and their needs, of course, in the field of electric vehicles as well. Now, what is the perspective of cities in the relation to electromobility? Actually, it's high on the agenda of many POLIS members, and some are really pioneers and innovators in the field of electromobility. Just to name a few: Amsterdam, Rotterdam, Barcelona, Berlin, and also the Île-de-France region around Paris. There's a firm belief generally in the potential of clean vehicles in general and electric vehicles in particular to address some of the key urban transport challenges that cities and regions are facing locally. Just to name a few, there's air quality, of course, there's noise, there's energy consumption, and in these challenges, electromobility can play an interesting role. At the same time, it's not a miracle solution either, and it's just only one piece of an integrated puzzle. Because, of course, if we would go to a one-to-one replacement of traditional vehicles with electric ones, we just end up with clean congestion, and that's not a solution to urban transport problems either. So we need to adopt this integrated, sustainable and multimodal point of view, bringing into the picture different modes, also modal shift, in order to be able to tackle the local challenges. At the same time, cities can play a key role in pushing the deployment of electric vehicles. They can be offering incentives, for example, to electric vehicle users through exemptions from access restrictions, low emission zones, as was mentioned as well in the London presentation, congestion charge, parking fees, dedicated lanes, so to have incentives in those areas for electric vehicle users. They also recognize that they have a responsibility in the field of implementing charging infrastructure. So, but at the same time, there it's important to come to viable business cases through public-private partnerships, which are interesting for all partners involved in the solution. They can also create the necessary critical mass through public procurement initiative and also through common procurement initiatives. And there's a lot of potential in new mobility services, such as car sharing, public e-bikes, etc. Cities are also looking to find big gains in the field of electromobility through captive fleets, so electric vehicles for freight purposes, but also public transport, taxis and municipal fleets. They also want to lead by example and give the good example to others. They also try to establish partnership with private fleet owners which are operating in the area. That's something that Amsterdam has been doing from the very beginning, for example. There are a number of framework enablers which could push electromobility and which have been pushing electromobility. There's a number of societal challenges that we're facing. There's the need and the wish for cities, or at least some of the cities, to be pioneers and to innovate. There are policy frameworks which support electromobility, and there are a number of planning tools which could come in handy when looking at electromobility deployment. So the approach that we are trying to adopt from the POLIS perspective is really to look at electromobility as a means to an end. It's not an end in itself, it's a support tool that helps to address societal challenges such as the ones listed here. We are looking, as I mentioned before, at an integrated, sustainable urban transport system, and in that respect, coordination strategies and integrated policies come in handy, and these in turn are supported by integrated planning tools. I will come back to that later on. And of course, innovation, research and development and take-up are very important in that respect. European projects such as UNPLUGGED and others are helpful for cities to gain access to innovation, and they like to profile themselves as living labs and as areas where innovation can be tested and taken up. Coming back to innovation, it's important to understand how innovation works. I mean, most European cities want to be innovative, but not all of them want to be the first to implement such a measure. Looking at this graph, not all of them want to be the innovators or even the early adopters. Some prefer to come in a bit later and be part of the early majority, for example. This has to do with the fact that there are various risks when implementing innovation. First of all, financial. Will we be able to afford the measure? But also political. Will the measure be accepted by the citizens? Will the citizens be in favor for it? And will it have an impact on the next elections? Effectiveness as well. If it's quite a new measure, maybe there is some insecurity and uncertainty in terms of whether the measure will actually solve the problems it is meant to solve. And finally, there are some challenges when it comes to implementation. Will we be able to introduce the measure in a smooth way? And maybe there might be delays or even extra costs throughout the implementation process. So when we look at electromobility, we want to make sure we come to this very important critical mass, that we come to actual market deployment. So what we are trying to do from the side of POLIS is as well to address these innovation concerns and to make sure that we can address a bigger group of cities with innovative measures. In other ways, to shorten the innovation cycle. Support tools that are important in that respect relate to transferability, for example. How can we better understand the context conditions for innovation and enhance the understanding of how to successfully transfer an innovative measure from one city to another, from one specific local context to another local context. So we have developed a transferability handbook which takes away some of these concerns and initial questions that cities have and allows cities to learn from the experience of other cities, from the mistakes they made as well as from the lessons they learned. Another important question that we always get relates to impact assessment. What is the intrinsic value of a measure and how can we better understand the value of such a measure? And that of course relates to cost-benefit analysis. And that's also something that we have addressed through a dedicated handbook. So just to explain, the TIDE project is looking at all kinds of innovations, including but not only electromobility, and is trying to help cities to become innovators themselves, but is also looking at how to mainstream innovations. Another enabler relates to policy frameworks. When we look at the cities and countries which are particularly successful at this stage in the field of electromobility, we see it's those countries where a national framework has been put in place, whether it be through enabling policies or funding of local initiatives. That's something that is happening in France, for example, in Spain, in Germany and Austria. Something that is not happening in my country, Belgium, and we see that we are really lagging behind in the field of electric vehicle deployment. Then you have European directives which play a role, such as the Clean Vehicle Directive that was introduced a couple of years ago and is pushing for public procurement initiatives which take into account clean vehicle criteria. Then there is the Clean Air Policy package, which links into air quality concerns and where electric vehicles can of course help to address these air quality challenges. And there's the more recent Urban Mobility package, which also mentions the effective potential of electric vehicles in achieving, for example, the target of CO2-free city logistics. But the most important recent initiative when it comes to European policy is the European Directive on the Deployment of Alternative Fuels Infrastructure, which looks at establishing national policy frameworks, including clear national targets and objectives by the end of 2016. So the member states are now kicking off activities to develop national action plans for the coming years. And those need to include an appropriate number of charging points accessible to the public by end 2020. So what we hope really is that this directive will help to overcome the chicken and egg problem by deploying the necessary infrastructure and also by unlocking additional investment when it comes to electromobility. Also, it should help to further strengthen the cooperation between the national and local levels, because clearly they each have their role to play. Another enabler are planning tools. Something that is really pushed on the European level at the moment is the Sustainable Urban Mobility Plan. and how this can help cities to plan their urban mobility policies and measures in an integrated way, taking into account different aspects and challenges as well as policy goals. So such a planning tool helps to look at urban transport in an integrated way from the air quality angle, but also noise, economic growth and development, energy policies, health issues, all these kind of things should be taken into account. Also, it helps to move towards a more performance-based planning approach, which means that you can evaluate the performance of a certain measure according to the specific results and policy goals that you have. And also what the SUMP particularly fosters is cooperation, coordination, and stakeholder involvement. And then you see that within this SUMP approach, there are also opportunities for electromobility and integrating the electromobility approach into the SUMP process and cycle, which consists of different types of modules, which I will not go into detail, but I will just highlight a few of them. Stakeholder involvement, for example. This is really key when it comes to deploying electromobility. You have the local authorities which need to liaise with the national level, but also with the European level when it comes to policy, legislation and regulation. But then they also need to link up to their citizens, who ultimately would be driving electric vehicles, and the service providers. And this is something which is rather new and where some further need to adapt to the new situation. They also need to closely work together with utilities, so the electricity providers and the OEMs providing the vehicles. SUMP is also about creating a long-term vision and objectives, and we see that cities are now looking into how they can bring in the electromobility dimension in their overall SUMP vision. For example, the city of Aachen in Germany has recently developed a new sustainable urban mobility plan, and actually they have included e-mobility as a cross-cutting topic. So also looking at it from the different transport modes, which is important because electric vehicles or electromobility are not only about the private car, but also about other modes of transport. And then what SUMPs are all about, as I said, is integration as well. And this is important because when you look at electromobility, you have actually quite a complex and complicated package of measures that you need to implement to make sure that electromobility can kick off in a successful way. There's a charging infrastructure that you need to look at. There's the public procurement dimension of electric vehicles. There's the grid. There are the incentives towards the users through all kinds of measures that I mentioned before, such as access restrictions, parking incentives for them. And then there's the collective modes versus the private vehicle. So to make sure that you integrate all these measures in an effective package, also SUMPs can be a supportive tool. And finally, where adaptation is further needed, is the evaluation dimension, the performance-based planning that I mentioned before. Because, of course, the current levels of EV penetration on the market might not allow for an assessment of impacts on the shorter term. That's why SUMPs probably need to extend their time horizon to also accommodate longer-term take-up scenarios for electromobility that go beyond the 5 to 10 year focus that they typically have at the moment. Still, electromobility does not only relate to mobility. There are some aspects that link into energy, of course. For example, the link to the grid, the provision of electricity. And that's why there are also other plans on the local level that come into play, such as, for example, the Sustainable Energy Action Plans, which are being promoted also on the European level through the Covenant of Mayors. We see that in those sustainable energy action plans, there are greenhouse gas emission targets, there are emission inventories, there are carbon assessment tools, but there are partly overlaps with SUMPs, but there are also different angles as well. For example, grid capacity, that's something that is typically not addressed in an SUMP approach. So it's important to come to an integrated planning dimension that takes account of these different aspects in an integrated way. And the directive and the action plans that the member states now need to develop for the Alternative Fuel Infrastructure Directive offers an opportunity to push for SUMPs as a local tool for cities to integrate electromobility in a proper way as well. Just to give a few concrete examples, Rotterdam is one of the forerunners in the field of electric vehicles, And the main reason for them to become involved in the electromobility approach was the air quality and health problems that they were facing locally. But also they wanted to position themselves as an innovator and see electromobility as an opportunity for economic growth and for branding. We are a city that invests in innovation, and we want to position ourselves that way. And also there are certain expectations from citizens locally, and they feel responsible for public space and charging infrastructure, so that's why they took up this role, which is all written down in the Rotterdam Climate Initiative, so a dedicated plan. So they feel responsible for setting the policy framework when it comes to electric vehicles, and also for initiating the deployment. Who becomes involved, where will we position infrastructure, when will we do it, how can we attract private parties to become involved in the story, and how can we work towards successful business cases. At the same time, they see this as a temporary situation, because as soon as the market picks up, as soon as we go hopefully towards mass market deployment, they will gradually withdraw, and then they leave it to the market players for electromobility to further pick up, and then the role of the public policy level becomes less important. Another example is Île-de-France. So actually we see already a lot of encouraging developments there, with an increase of 20% of public transport use between 2001 and 2010, and also a stagnating car use. But at the same time they see that it's not enough. The number of inhabitants today, 11.7 million, will increase to 12.4 by 2020. The private fleet still represents 60% of diesel cars, and they see that they are facing very severe challenges in the field of air quality. It was very recently still in the press again for the Paris region. So they see that road transport accounts for more than 50% of nitrogen oxides emissions, as well as 25% of particulate emissions. And there is a need for a further 20% reduction in transport greenhouse gas emissions to achieve the targets they have set themselves by 2020. So what they want is to have 400,000 alternatively fueled vehicles by 2020, including electric vehicles. They've already done a lot, and they're still planning to do a lot in that area. You have Autolib, which I'm sure most of you have heard of before, the electric car sharing initiative. But also there are new regional policies to further encourage clean vehicle deployment and to achieve the targets they have set in their own sustainable urban mobility plan. So they want to further extend the charging points network, and develop shared services with carpooling and car sharing initiatives. They also want to promote the use of clean vehicles in mobility priority segments, as they call it, for example, by making sure that a certain percentage of the public fleets is clean, which should be minimum 25% by 2020. And then they encourage the local authorities in the Île-de-France area to develop measures in favor of clean vehicles, such as preferential parking, dedicated lanes, and so on. These are just two concrete examples of member cities within the POLIS networks that are heavily investing in electromobility. And to conclude my presentation, just a few words on inductive charging, the topic of the UNPLUGGED project. So within the TIDE project on innovation, we also looked at the potential of inductive charging, and it became clear that for many cities this is a very promising new technology, but when it came to the difficulty to implement, they said this was still very high. So there are still many questions and concerns from the side of cities and regions that they would like to see addressed. And I will just name a few of them, but at the same time I'm very happy to see that many of the issues that I've listed here were also taken up in the UNPLUGGED presentations that we've heard today. So I will, of course, feed back the results of the project to our member cities and regions, showing them that these issues are indeed being addressed and looked into. For example, the implementation cost of inductive charging infrastructure, which, according to the information there, they have, seems to be 5 to 10 times more expensive compared to traditional charging infrastructure. And there we come, of course, as well to the business case, which still is challenging for the traditional standard charging infrastructure, and even more so when it comes to inductive charging. Also, they feel that currently there is a very limited or even no offer of vehicle vehicles with inductive charging possibilities. So then we are looking at retrofitting, which is very complicated, or buying new vehicles that allow for inductive charging. They also have questions with regard to the impact of inductive charging on the grid. And even if it's just a matter of reassuring them that it's not the case, as a public institution, of course, they need to be able to address all questions that relate to safety concerns when it comes to magnetic fields and possible health risks. Standardization, an important topic, and it's been presented already in one of the previous presentations. So they want one technique for different types and brands of vehicles. They need standard communication protocols which allow for interoperability for public infrastructure, and they need to be sure that they can connect inductive charging infrastructure to the back office to set up an interoperable network. Then they also have the feeling that there is limited cooperation at the moment between the inductive charging research world on the one hand and car manufacturers on the other hand. And if there is contact, that it seems to be like one-to-one contact between researchers and one OEM, but not several OEMs, for example. Dynamic inductive charging they feel to be still far away and more feasible for motorways. And very complicated to realize for buses, for example, which run through very consolidated and complicated urban areas, which link into different types of infrastructure. But they see a lot of opportunities at the same time for inductive charging, for example, in relation to taxis and municipal fleets or rental cars near residential areas, for example, for urban freight, and not in the least for public transport. So buses with fixed routes, there are some challenges with regard to electric vehicles that could be addressed and overcome through inductive charging. There would be a reduced need for battery capacity. They could charge while waiting at interchanges before starting a route. They could avoid the inconvenience of setting up charging infrastructure with plugins and cables, and it would reduce the risk of vandalism, so just to name a few of the benefits that they see. Then again, they want to make sure that they can use different types, or that they can use the same type of infrastructure for different types of vehicles, such as buses and trucks. And they see a key opportunity in establishing public-private partnerships to create a wireless charging infrastructure network. This was mentioned as well in the London presentation. So this is it from my side, just to give you a bit of a broader perspective on electromobility in cities and regions. Thank you.
Thank you.